Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar titled Canada, a Trending H-1B Alternative and What You Need to Know. Today's presentation will be approximately 45 minutes long, including an audience Q&A at the end of the presentation. This webinar is also being recorded, and we will send you all a link to download the recording after the live session. We also encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation, and to do that, all you have to do is use the question function you see on the right-hand side of your screen. And now a little bit about Envoy. For nearly 20 years, Envoy has been on a mission to fix the inefficient, frustrating, and confusing immigration process. We combine expert legal representation with innovative technology to deliver the only platform that makes it seamless for companies to hire, mobilize, and manage a global workforce. We secure work authorization in over 150 countries. We've grown 41% year over year, and we work with over 1,000 customers. We are particularly proud of our NPS score, which is a testament to the employee experience we provide. Also joining us today, very exciting, is Mobsquad. Mobsquad is an innovative company that helps U.S. companies retain their top-tier foreign talent when they do not have an immigration path in the U.S. So a great example of that would be for an employee who, let's say, isn't selected in the H-1B cap. They have a unique partnership with the Canadian government that allows them to get software engineers and their spouses visas and have them relocated and working in as little as just 4 weeks. Mobsquad will outline more about their model and approach later in this webinar. We have two presenters that I'd like to introduce to everyone today, starting with Jim Yang. Jim is a licensed Canadian immigration practitioner with Envoy and is a subject matter expert on Canadian immigration policies and procedures. He has over 6 years of corporate immigration experience across several industries, including oil and gas, technology, transportation, manufacturing, pharmaceutical, and professional services. He is able to provide comprehensive policy consulting, case strategy, and compliance advice for Canadian immigration and has project experience with immigration process optimization. Before he joined Envoy, Jim worked in multinational immigration firms where he was responsible for managing the delivery of business immigration services for corporate accounts and consulted on all sorts of Canadian immigration matters ranging from work permits, visas, LMIAs, and permanent residency. We're also excited to be joined by Irfan Raji, founder and CEO of Mobsquad. Irfan is also a venture partner at Relay Ventures, an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and he is a senior advisor to the Canadian government. So we have a really great presentation in store for you all today. And with that, one last thing before we get started. This is not intended today as legal advice, and it should not be relied upon as such. So for any additional information about what we are going to talk about today, be sure to consult with a qualified attorney or licensed practitioner. And now I will hand things off to Irfan.
Thank you very much, Erin, and thank you everyone for joining today and your interest in the topic of Canada as it relates to immigration and specifically to business immigration. Maybe to get started this afternoon, we could lay the foundation of what Canadian immigration has looked like as a quantum of immigration and over time. And so maybe we can go to the next slide here, Erin, and we can look at over the last 20 years or so, you would see that in Canada, we've seen increasing levels of immigration. This is because it's been a policy platform for every party that's been in power over the last couple decades and even longer than that. And to give you an idea of what this quantum looks like, this year, the target for immigration in Canada is about 350,000 people. And the stated policy objective of the government is to add about 1% of the population through immigration to the country each year. So as the population of the country has grown, you've seen this number has also grown over time. What may be interesting to those of you on the call, and you'll see in the next slide, is the percentage of this immigration that's actually business related. If we move to the next slide, you'll see that about 50% or more of the immigrants that come to Canada are what we call economic migrants. So these are people that come that either already have a job or are looking for employment and are sponsored into the country. This is different than many other countries around the world, including our knowledge of the U.S., where there's much more family sponsorship. And even within the family sponsorship that you see here on this slide, a lot of that is individuals that are being brought on as the spouse of an individual who is coming as an economic migrant. Probably not surprising to those of you that maybe know a little bit about Canada, we also have a pretty big refugee program, and so that's also a big chunk of the folks that come into the country. If you move to the next slide, you'll see something that for those of you that haven't been to Canada or aren't Canadian, may be surprised to see, which is that this strategy of increasing immigration is actually a strategy that has existed irrespective of political stripe. In Canada, our sort of more center-left party is the Liberal Party, that's in red on the slide, and our more center-right party is the Conservative Party. The analog to the U.S. would be the Democrats and the Republicans. And you can see that irrespective of what side is in power, immigration has consistently grown in the Canadian context. And what this has done, if we get to the next slide, is it's created some rhetoric in the press on both sides of the border, whether that's Canadian or U.S. press, that has suggested that Canada potentially be a alternative to the H-1B in the U.S. Given the stricter scrutiny, and for those of you that work in law or in HR, you probably know that the increasing rates of requests for evidence continue to grow. So this alternative of using Canada as a place to bring foreign talent is continuing to increase in popularity in both, I think, conversations in our client companies and certainly conversations in the popular press. On the next slide, a few highlights from a Canadian perspective in terms of, what does this look like in terms of the dialogue that's happening here in the press. What's interesting is that irrespective of political party, liberal, conservative, otherwise, policymakers in Canada continue to be welcoming of immigration. So while you see different debate happening often in the press in the U.S., where different parties maybe have a different stance with respect to economic immigration or immigration overall or work permits, in Canada, it's been supported really on both sides. It continues to be, which sort of continues to open up this opportunity for those that are H-1B challenged in terms of not getting in the cap or not being able to renew a visa, potentially considering Canada as an alternative or a place to start an office. You may have heard that Canada recently went through a federal election that was held on October 21st, so about 3 weeks ago. And, for the 5 or 6 week period, to the run up to the election, the topic of immigration actually was rarely, if ever, brought up. It seemed to be a policy that is supported by both sides of the aisle. And so while there were many things that were contested in the election, the Liberal Party, which was the governing party before the election, came out successful again, this time with a minority government, not a majority government. But the topic of immigration is a political debate, really isn't one that we see in the same way that I think that, as a Canadian, at least, we observe occurring in the U.S. Jim, why don't I pass it on to you?
Thank you, Ron. So let's have a look, if we can move on to the next slide. Let's have a look at how people can get into Canada. Now, there are essentially 4 common pathways in which we see people entering the country. The first is a popular method in which many employers use to start getting somebody into Canada to work, and this is called the Temporary Foreign Workers Program. It is used by employers in all fields of work, ranging from technology, agriculture, professional services, manufacturing, and many other industries as well. The basis of this program is really to say to the government that, there are no qualified or willing Canadians available for this labor shortage we're experiencing here in our Canadian economy. And thus, we need this individual from a different country to fill in the job need. Now, work permits under the Temporary Foreign Workers Program can be issued for up to 2 years. And due to recent immigration changes, this pathway has really benefited many companies in retaining foreign workers faster and made the immigration process more predictable. Now, economic migrants include people inside or outside of Canada who are applying for permanent residence status that can contribute to Canada's economic benefit or talent pool. This is equivalent to kind of the US green card, and people are chosen on a merit-based system versus a lottery process. What this means is that a person can be selected to obtain permanent residency status based upon elements such as their age, education, work experience, adaptability, language abilities, and if they have a valid job offer from a Canadian employer. The third method is through family sponsorship, where one basically obtains permanent residency status in Canada through a direct relative, such as a spouse, common law, child, or parent of a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. And lastly, refugees that are seeking protection from Canada is the last method. Aaron, if you can move on to the next slide. Now, diving into a deeper look at the Temporary Foreign Workers Program, this is essentially one of the two most used methods in which companies can retain foreign talent in Canada, and is often referred to as the LMIA process, or in long known as the Labor Market Impact Assessment category. Now, when making an LMIA application, what a company is really doing is telling the Canadian government that, hey, we have conducted a labor market test, and no Canadians or permanent residents are qualified or willing to fill this role that we're currently in need of. And as a result, we're requesting permission to hire this foreign talent that we have assessed. So how does a Canadian company conduct a labor market test or and request for a work permit under the Temporary Foreign Workers Program? On a high level, there are essentially three steps within this process. First, the Canadian company must post the role on different job platforms to advertise the position, and the ad must be active for a minimum period of 4 months, along with adhering to a set of Service Canada criteria. After the job postings, a package consisting of recruitment efforts made, along with your company's information and the job description details will need to be submitted to the government for review. For example, a piece of recruitment information that is very good to include is an Excel chart listing all the candidates that applied for the job and were called or interviewed for the role but did not qualify. This evidences kind of the efforts made to recruit Canadians and demonstrates why the foreign talent resource is needed for the role due to his or her qualifications. This step with the government, this review step with the government usually takes about 2 to 4 months time. And upon receiving a positive opinion or approval on the LMIA, the company can then apply for a work permit for the worker. Generally speaking, this process in total takes approximately 4 to 7 months time to complete from job posting to getting the work permit. Moving on to the next slide. Now, looking at the pathway to permanent residency for skilled workers overseas or in Canada that is often used is the express entry system. The express entry process was really designed to replace a first-come, first-served model of accepting economic PR applications. And its purpose is to facilitate a faster PR process for skilled workers who are more likely to succeed in Canada economically based on a merit or point-based system. Now, how does express entry work? The first step is to determine if one meets the criteria of at least one of the federal economic immigration programs in Canada. And upon confirmation, a person would express their interest into coming into Canada as a skilled worker by creating what's called an express entry profile, which basically consists of information about their skills, work experience, language ability, education, and other details. After the individual submits their profile within the express entry system, they would get a score to determine their place in a pool of applicants through a comprehensive ranking classification. and the government will regularly invite top-ranking candidates from the pool to apply for permanent residency. I often like to explain to my clients that the express entry system is very similar to a process of applying for a job in LinkedIn, for example. You know, as a job seeker, you would first find a job posting that would interest you, in which you meet the qualifications. Upon confirming that you have the skills needed for the role, you would, email the recruiter your resume listing all your credentials, experiences, and skills. And basically, the HR division of that company would compare how competitive you are versus the other candidates that have applied. You know, if you meet all the criteria of the job and is more beneficial to the company than the other candidates, you would receive a call to interview for the role. So that's very similar to kind of the express entry system. Like applying for kind of a job in where you submit your resume, submitting your express entry profile does not mean that you will receive an invitation to apply. And it is not the same as submitting your application for permanent residency, which is often confused. It is after you submit your profile and receive an invitation from the government, at which point you're making the actual application for permanent residency. With respect to the timelines of this process, it typically takes upwards of 14 months' time. We can move to the next slide. Here we will look at an overview without going too deep at the actual point-based system of express entry and what elements or factors the government is looking at when it comes to score allocation. So let's just say we have an individual that qualifies under the Federal Skilled Workers Program, for example, which is one of the economic immigration streams for Canadian permanent residency. Now we have to look at what score he will receive, depending on his background information, and determine if he'll be competitive in the express entry pool and what the likelihood would be in him receiving an invitation to apply. As you can see in the chart, age is one of those elements that Canada puts quite a heavy value on when it comes to economic growth, along with the level of education. Now, how education is evaluated is on the basis of its equivalency to Canada. So, for example, let's say we have a person that has a 4-year U.S. bachelor's degree, and then upon getting it professionally assessed, it equates to a Canadian bachelor's. At that point, he would receive 120 points. But now let's say a foreign national that has a 1-year master's degree, for example, and upon him having his degree assessed, it only equates to a Canadian bachelor's. In that example, he would only receive the 120 points for the education instead of the 135 points. Up next, we have an individual's English or French language proficiency. And of course, the higher you score on your language tests in the categories of reading, writing, listening, and speaking, the higher you will get express entry score. And finally, professional experience outside of Canada is also valued and given a score depending on the duration of employment. Now, where it might make a significant difference for a lot of individuals in meeting the cutoff score is having Canadian work experience or a valid job offer in Canada. Having the combination of both Canadian and foreign work experience will most definitely help in achieving a higher score. And with the addition of a valid job offer in Canada, that would also put you at a competitive edge. Currently, the cutoff to receive an invitation to apply for permanent residence is at 475 points. This number does fluctuate since the government issues out invitations to apply on a monthly basis. However, it commonly tends to hover around that 450 to 480 score mark most of the time. Moving on to the next slide. So there has been two new enhancements to the Canadian immigration system in the past few years. The first is the creation of the now permanent program of Global Talent Stream, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes, along with the system of express entry, as discussed in our previous slide. The Global Talent Stream was a program that was introduced in 2017 by the federal government as part of Canada's innovation agenda to essentially help business attract the talent they need to succeed in the global marketplace. It is streamed under the Temporary Foreign Workers Program, and it is a fast-track method that enables 2-week processing time for labor market applications. When coming up with the Global Talent Stream, the government really tailored this to Canadian businesses looking to hire specific occupations and looked at how to expedite the immigration process for in-demand jobs such as software engineers, IT analysts, and application developers. Moving on to the next slide. So how does the Global Talent Stream apply, and what are we talking about here in actual practice? Now, if this is our regular labor market test process in hiring a foreign worker, where the steps are to first advertise and post the job, and then submit an application to the government to say that there are no available Canadians for the position. One of the beneficial factors of the Global Talent Stream is the dropping or elimination of the advertising or recruitment requirement, which is extremely attractive for many companies because it saves time, money, and effort, especially if you already have a suitable foreign candidate that you have in mind. Moving on to the next slide. So as many of the listeners here know, the search for a suitable candidate and kind of navigating through the immigration process is already difficult enough. And thus what the Canadian government is doing through the GTS or Global Talent Stream program, what they're trying to say is that, we understand that Canadian companies are doing quite a bit to recruit for jobs in which our country is experiencing a labor shortage of. So let's not dictate how the employers need to advertise for the roles and the way that it is done. Now, do keep in mind that while recruitment efforts or advertising efforts are not a requirement a company needs to demonstrate to the government under the Global Talent Stream, there is a question in the application that asks still whether or not the position has been advertised. However, in most cases, if not all the applications that I've assisted with, the answers from companies are still a big resounding yes, because companies still need to post the job in order to have applicants apply for them, but it might not be to the specifics to how the Canadian government wants it to be done. Moving on to the next slide. So while employers do not need to adhere to the LMIA recruitment or advertising requirement under the Global Talent Stream, the catch is that the companies are required to work with the government to create and develop a robust strategy known as the Labor Market Benefits Plan. Now, this plan essentially needs to showcase the company's commitment to activities that will have a positive impact on the Canadian labor market by explaining how the company will be creating jobs and or increasing skills for the Canadian labor market. A good thing to note about this is that the government will genuinely work hand in hand with companies in developing a detailed, but at the same time, realistic 2-year action plan, as many companies do not have a concrete idea of what kind of commitments they can make. From my personal experience in participating with the employers and Service Canada to come up with this labor market benefits plan, I would have to say that I was actually truly impressed on the level of understanding the officers have for businesses and the willingness to work with employers to come up with commitments that are actually achievable instead of, forcing Canadian companies to partake in certain activities. Some common and measurable commitments that I've seen proposed, for example, are providing paid co-op or internship opportunities for Canadians, establishing kind of like an educational partnership with schools, or developing and improving an HR model as they relate to attracting and retaining Canadian workers. Now, if I can direct you guys to the attention of the timelines under the global talent stream, the removal of the advertising requirement eliminates 4 weeks from the overall timeline within the regular labor market test process and expedites the adjudication of the LMIA application from 4 months or more to 2 weeks, because within the Service Canada agency, there's a dedicated service channel created specifically dealing with the Global Talent Stream program. Moving on to the next slide. So as part of Canada's innovation agenda, the government has also established a 2-week work permit processing time policy for eligible high-skilled workers. And as a result, the work permit under the work permit under the GTS method can be obtained as fast as within 4 weeks' time, not including the time it takes for biometrics collections and the visa stamping process. Now, going back to the express entry system for applying for a Canadian permanent resident status, we often see that having an LMIA under the global talent stream can also translate to what's known as a valid job offer for the PR process, as defined by by immigration regulations. And what this means is that foreign nationals will receive a higher score for express entry, which will result in a better chance of receiving an invitation to apply. Moving on to the next slide. So with the inclusion of a job offer, an applicant's merit is boosted, and under the express entry system, an applicant is able to get PR status within 7 to 8 months' time. I will now pass it back to Irfan to talk about some other benefits and reasons as to why companies are becoming more and more attracted to setting up and coming into Canada.
Great. Thank you, Jim. So as you've seen with this context, Canada is a country that is certainly a country open to immigration, trying to grow its immigration numbers, specifically as it relates to economic immigration. And with recent policy changes, first put in 2017 and then reaffirmed actually earlier this year in the 2019 budget of the Canadian government with the 2 programs of Global Talent Stream and Express Entry. We've got a government that actually is very pro bringing knowledge workers in, and specifically technical workers and things like software engineering. And so many companies have looked at that and said, that's pretty attractive. If you think about the alternative in the US of trying to get an H-1B visa where you have to go through a lottery process, less than 50% of people win the lottery, potentially you have a request for evidence, and then months later you get the visa issued. Thinking about the total time to bring talent in, that could be 6, 12, 14 months. The idea of being able to get talent into Canada that's a knowledge worker or software engineer as an example in 4 or 5 weeks is pretty compelling. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that it's not just the timing of getting talent to North America that's really attractive and why we see a lot of companies starting offices in Canada. It's the fact that you can grab talent from around the world. You're not really limited by really anything in terms of your ability to recruit. So, a typical U.S. company usually can only recruit in the U.S. outside of using the H-1B to try to go across the world. But, with the Global Talent Stream program in Canada, the world becomes your recruiting pool, which is a much larger pool and improves your odds of success. The second benefit is, while not in the U.S., it's very proximate to the U.S. A city like Halifax, where we have some of our workers from Mobsquad working for U.S. companies, is a 1.5-hour flight to New York or to Boston. Or a city like Calgary or Vancouver on the West Coast is a 2.5-hour flight to San Francisco, versus Vancouver. So that's not that difficult to get to and from. A third benefit in terms of bringing people to Canada versus working with them on an offshore basis is that you have intellectual property control. And things like software engineering, where intellectual property is really important, working in regimes like Russia or China or India is very difficult because proving conclusive ownership is harder. Whereas Canada's intellectual property controls they're similar, if not the same, to the United States. The fourth benefit is that when you bring talent into Canada, after they get their permanent residency card, which happens as soon as 6 or 7 months upon entry, 3 years later they're eligible to apply for citizenship. This is super attractive in that if you think about talent in some jurisdictions like India or China or Russia, being able to offer Canadian citizenship makes the value proposition, the employment value proposition, much stronger, which improves the quality of talent willing to work with you or your company. The fifth thing is if you bring a knowledge worker into Canada, you also have the ability to get their spouse an open work permit. And so that's guaranteed under this Global Talent Stream program. If you bring somebody in, their spouse also gets a work permit, which is, sometimes more difficult to do in the United States. And the last reason is, the cost of living in Canada is much lower in most markets than most markets in the U.S. And so it's very attractive to talent to want to come here. If you hit the next slide, you'll see that, not surprising probably to most, with all of these benefits, a lot of large companies have started offices in Canada. So Amazon, Facebook, Google, Instacart just came last year and have hired a substantial number of people in Canada, whether these are Canadian citizens or foreign nationals that they've brought in quickly via the Global Talent Stream program. Amazon last year hired 1,000 software engineers in Vancouver and is looking at hiring 2,000 software engineers this year. The challenge that we find, if you go to the next slide, is that for most companies, they're maybe thinking about hiring maybe 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 people. They're not trying to hire 2,000 people. And the fixed costs of coming to Canada are actually very difficult to do that. You have to have a cross-border legal structure, a tax structure. You have to make sure you make government remittances, which in Canada are many. There's the Canada Pension Plan, employment insurance, health benefits. You've got workers' compensation remittances that need to be made. You need to find a health benefits plan. And finding a health benefits plan for a handful of people can be very difficult to do because insurance providers want to diversify the risk over a large group of people and may be uneconomic. You have to find a place for these people to work. And there's just the ongoing administrative complexity. And when you add in the last layer, which is when you think about using something like the Global Talent Stream and making commitments to the government to hire other Canadians or hire interns or do local market training, the total fixed costs of coming to Canada make it pretty difficult to do if you're doing this subscale. That's really where, if you go to the next slide, you'll see Mobsquad created a model. As was mentioned by Aaron earlier on the call, I'm also a partner in a venture capital firm called Relay Ventures, and Relay has an office in Menlo Park and in Toronto. And we have a number of companies in the U.S., and we saw this challenge for our portfolio companies that were trying to hire 5 or 10 people in Canada. And so we said, well, what if we could come up with a model that deals with these fixed costs and variabilizes them across a number of employers? And so that's the model that we've created in partnership, really, in getting people into the country with Envoy. You'll see on the left side here, Mobsquad creates a contract with our U.S. clients, usually technology companies, and we allow that U.S. company to keep their team together. So if you have an individual that can't get into the U.S. or gets kicked out of the U.S. because their H-1B wasn't renewed or their OPT wasn't successfully converted into an H-1B, we move that person to Canada. You keep them on your team, effectively virtually via Mobsquad. It's a virtual subsidiary where we're the sponsoring employer, but we really contract them back to you exclusively. It's an attractive proposition as well to employees. If you look on the left side of this chart, they continue to work with you. They get to do the great work they're continuing to do. They get to work out of a great facility built for remote work in Canada. We get them a work permit in Canada. We get them permanent residency. We get their spouse a work permit. They get top-tier benefits and top-tier compensation in Canada. And they have an opportunity to have a great quality of life given the cost of living here that's much lower. So a real solution for those who want to dip their toe in the water into coming into Canada without having to go through all the fixed costs and the complexity to try to see if this model works for them, or a permanent solution for those that maybe only want to have 5 or 10 or 15 people located in this market, so they can ensure they get to keep their top quality talent or recruit international talent that they're having a hard time getting into the U.S., but they want to make sure are on their team and have strong intellectual property control and proximity to the U.S. The next slide will show you a recent example that we worked on with Envoy. This was an individual who was actually working in New York. Juan is his name. He was working in New York with PETAL Card, which is one of our clients now, a fintech based in New York. His H-1B failed to renew. He and his spouse and his 13-month-old daughter were forced with the situation of having to leave the U.S. within a matter of weeks, losing his job and having to move back to China. PETAL was then forced with the situation of losing an employee, a key employee, somebody that had already worked for them and they really enjoyed working with. And so they called us, and within 4 weeks, we had moved Juan to Halifax. He was sponsored into Canada by Mobsquad. He's now a Mobsquad employee, and he's been contracted back exclusively to PETAL Card. So he's kept his same job, doing the same work for the same employer, working for the same people, just doing it remotely from Canada. And PETAL was able to keep an employee and not have to have the complication of that, and not have to have the complication of the fixed cost and struggle of having to set up an entity in Canada. Aaron, that's really it for our presentation. I think we have some time here for questions.
Yep, thank you both so much. I'm going to give a few seconds for any people who haven't had a chance to submit their questions to do so now. We've had a few come through. The first one: how can an individual who does not have Canada experience reach the cutoff score? I think that might be a good one for you.
Yeah, I can definitely comment on that. So, kind of going back to the score that, the scoring chart that we were, that was on our presentation. There are many other factors to kind of increase the score for your express entry profile. So, one of the, quickest way of getting a higher score is to get a better score on your language or what's called the English proficiency language test. So that's one way of getting a higher score. And then also to include your foreign experience or have a job offer that's valid, have a job offer from an employer in Canada that can also increase your express entry profile score as well.
Yeah. I might also comment a bit here, Aaron, so that one of the things that we do is, because we get the foreign work permit issued in 4 weeks and we get this individual to Canada, for our employees on Mobsquad, we've not had a cutoff score problem because they've got a bona fide offer from us as a Canadian employer. And then when they hit the ground here, if it takes a year for them to get those extra points to get a year of Canadian experience, they do have a year of Canadian experience working for Mobsquad. So we get them over that threshold pretty easily.
That's great. Thank you. Next question. Sorry, one second. What are the terms of the company transfer visa for Canada comparable to an L in the U.S., an L1?
Yeah, so we do have kind of a similar category to the L1 category that the United States have, which is called, the intercompany transferee category. So the criteria are very similar to the criteria under the L. There are basically 3 divisions within the intercompany transfer category. The first one being executives, the second one being in a managerial capacity, and the third one being the specialized knowledge capacity. The requirements are that, you need to have that 1 year of full-time experience with the company abroad in order to transfer into Canada. And depending on, the capacity that you're coming into, you need to either have, specialized knowledge, which means, something that's proprietary or, special to the company. That specific knowledge in order to kind of qualify under the specialized knowledge route. Or if you're coming into a managerial capacity, we need to demonstrate that you're either supervising professional employees or managing an essential function of the organization.
Thank you. One more about ensuring that intellectual property is safe for somebody working in Canada. Irfan, could you speak a little bit more? You mentioned it briefly earlier in the presentation, but if you could maybe speak a little bit more to that, that would be great.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, this is a super critical point. And so what is important in Canadian law is that if there's an employer-employee relationship, it is clear that anything that employee develops in the realm of business that that employer is in is conclusively owned by the employer. And so at Mobsquad, we are the sponsoring employer. So anything that any of our software engineers develops is conclusively owned by us as a company. That allows us the opportunity to sell that to our clients and guarantee ownership of it. Our contracts are pretty long and they're pretty robust. I mean, they're 16 pages each for the employee and for our contract to our client. And the reason is a lot of that is about intellectual property ownership and transfer. And so as intellectual property is being developed by our software engineers in the virtual subsidiary in Canada, we are contemporaneously selling it real time to our clients so that that IP is transferred on a continuous basis.
Great. And then we just have time for two more. So one for Irfan again, how is Mobsquad different from a PEO?
Another great question. We're similar in one way in that we manage all of the benefits and it's a co-employment model. We're different in that we do a lot more than a standard PEO. So for those of you in the US, you might have heard of PEOs like TriNet, who we actually are a customer of with our US employees because we have some people in the US working for Mobsquad. We do much more than that. So we actually have a physical space that's designed for remote work. So our flagship office in Calgary that we just built out, we put $2.3 million onto one floor for software engineers. There's 16 video conference rooms on this floor. We feed people breakfast and lunch. We take care of them. We help them get a home in Canada. We help their spouse get a job. We help their kids get into the right schools. We get them private banking. We offer management services as well. So we actually have people that are in the office physically to make sure that the employees are being taken care of, that they're showing up to work, that they're performing. So it's a PEO plus, plus, plus. So the standard services of the PEO, plus all of these other benefits, plus the immigration support, and plus doing all of the work that's required to meet the commitments under the global talent stream. So it's kind of the base level plus a number of other solutions that we add on top of it to make really effectively a virtual subsidiary work. Like this is, if you were to set up an office in Canada, what would all the things be that you would have? We do all of those things for you.
Excellent, thank you. And then last question, for both of you, what is one prediction you have for Canadian immigration in 2020?
Irfan, I'll let you go first and then I can comment after.
Yeah, I mean, we're in conversations all the time with the government. We're very fortunate in that our position, given that we're so policy aligned, allows us to have conversations with the federal government on immigration. So, I don't want this to come across the wrong way, but we've been fortunate to host the Prime Minister in our office here at Mobsquad in July. We had the Minister of International Trade here in September, or actually in August. And I had a one-on-one with the Canadian Minister of Immigration before the election in September on exactly this topic. And so, I tell you that those conversations have all led to the same conclusion, which is we expect that there will be continued increases in immigration and a continued desire to have more knowledge worker immigration into the country foreseeably for at least the next year or two, if not longer.
Yeah, and I definitely echo that, Irfan. And I think my opinion is that, with the enhancements such as the global talent stream and express entry, it really has kind of, improved our Canadian immigration process. And these programs are, now made permanent. So I think, with the new government in place, we're just going to see, better improvements into the program. And also, hopefully, they'll implement faster processing times with respect to other streams as well.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. I have just a few more things before we wrap up for today. We have a ton of great webinars coming up between now and the end of the year. So if you go to envoyglobal.com/webinars and events, You can read all about everything we have coming up. We have a lot of great year-end reviews and recaps coming up in December, and a lot of great content coming up about the H-1B as cap season approaches. So head to the website, do a little reading, and then sign up for whatever speaks to you. And then if you're not already, make sure that you are following Envoy on social media. We're always sharing lots of great content, some great guides for you to help navigate what we already know can be a very complex process. So follow us, make sure you're subscribed to our blog, and you'll never miss a post. And then, of course, SHRM and HRCI credits available, which will also be sent to you in the follow-up with the recording. So thank you again very much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.